Good morning, everyone. Is it on? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this month's First Monday Speaker Series. My name is Kyler Van Berkom, co-chair of Student Symposium, and on behalf of the Co-Curricular Committee and the Andreas Center, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stanley Carlson-Thies. Dr. Carlson-Thies is the founder and president of the Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance. He has served as director of faith-based policy studies at the Center of Public Justice, where he still remains a senior fellow. He has been recognized by the Center for Law and Religious Freedom and the Christian Legal Society, having received the William Bentley Ball Life and Religious Liberty Defense Award. He was also named as one of the 12 individuals reinterpreting God and country by the National Journal. Furthermore, Dr. Carlson-Thies served as a member of President Bush's White House office, as well as the Church/State Task Force of President Obama's Advisory Council. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Stanley Carlson-Thies?
Good morning. These logos represent just a few of the many distinctive community-serving organizations that we all depend on. And it isn't just you and me, or people of faith in general, who count on these and many other faith-based and conviction-driven organizations. Let me mention just 3 amazing facts about faith-based services. You've heard of gospel rescue missions, sometimes dreary places located in a bad part of town. That's kind of their image. This is a different one. Village of Hope is a residential program for homeless families and people operated by the Orange County Rescue Mission just south of Los Angeles. The village and the mission serve thousands of families and individuals who need spiritual guidance, meals, a safe place to sleep, medical care, addiction services. These people are homeless, but of course they're not worthless. And to honor them as people made in the image of God, as we all are, the structure itself and its chapel have been designed to reflect God's beauty. And the chapel, in fact, has specially commissioned stained glass windows. I'm sorry I can't show you a picture of them. And why is that? Because beauty should be part of everyone's surroundings, even if you're homeless. Do the services provided by parachurch ministries and by congregations really make a difference? University of Pennsylvania professor Ram Kanan, a self-confessed agnostic Jew, has documented the value to the community. Here is pictured First Baptist Church in Philadelphia, and Professor Kanan and his research team estimate that it puts positive value into its neighborhood of more than $6 million annually. Through its school, by preventing suicides, helping people find jobs, preventing family breakups, helping ex-prisoners become productive members of the community, and more. Isn't that amazing? $6 million a year. The Wait No More initiative, a focus on the family, encourages and equips churches to adopt children out of foster care. Kids often end up stuck in foster care, as you know, shuttled from one family to another, and sometimes aging out of the system without ever being reunited with their original family or being adopted by a new family. Many of these foster kids are hard to place, but when Focus on the Family partnered with the foster care system in Colorado and with Colorado families, a miracle happened. In less than 2 years, this initiative of Focus on the Family cut the number of kids in foster care in Colorado in half. A startling success that amazed government officials. Well, these and many other faith-based organizations are expressions of biblical faith and of the love of Jesus. I call them the hands and feet of the church. They provide a range of loving services far beyond the capabilities of you and I, and far beyond the capabilities of a local church, which is dedicated to worship and discipleship and may serve the community, but can't do it on this scale. So here we have hundreds of thousands of faith-inspired organizations, both nonprofits and businesses, whose work is vital in our communities, vital for the well-being of countless millions of individuals and families. And yet, because these are organizations shaped by faith, their freedom to be themselves, and sometimes their very existence, is at growing risk today. What they do differently, often in direct obedience to Jesus, is increasingly labeled by many in our society to be just bigotry, sectarianism, and hatred. Because their values are sometimes out of step with our increasingly secularized, even in some ways anti-Christian society. Many powerful groups and political leaders not only condemn their distinctive ways, but seek to use the law to force them to conform or to force them out of operation. So that's the focus of my remarks this morning. Why, if we are to be faithful, we need organizations, Jesus-inspired organizations, and then what these organizations need, the freedom they need to be distinctive if they are to flourish in our era. So thank you for being here this morning. My thanks to Dordt College and to the First Monday team for inviting me to talk with you. And most of all, thank you for your own lives of faith. As I talk with you about this vital topic of organizations and organizational faithfulness, I will be drawing on some of the key ideas of Abraham Kuyper. Although Kuyper's era was a century and more ago, and of course he worked in the Netherlands and not here in the United States except for brief visits, in many ways he's a co-founder of Dordt College, and I hope you understand that. And if you know his life and thought and work at all, you'll know his ideas are critical for our topic of organizations, organizational freedom, organizational faithfulness. And let me start with this Kuyper quote that you've heard many times. "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" That ringing declaration came from Kuyper's great speech on sphere sovereignty, that important principle about how government should relate to churches and other organizations and to individuals. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I wanted to note here that Kuyper gave that speech to inaugurate one of the many important organizations that he helped to create, the Free University of Amsterdam, a Reformed or Calvinist university, a university that through much of its history has offered a distinctively Christian alternative to the secular universities that the Dutch government operated. So, as Kuyper reminds us, there's not one square inch of life outside of Jesus' care and command, not your personal life, not your church worship, not your labors in the library, not your work as an employee or a leader of a business. And yet, while Jesus claims kingship over every square inch of life, Kuyper also reminds us that Jesus doesn't call us to what we're often accused of, a theocracy, to use the government to force our fellow citizens to bow their heads and knees to King Jesus. Rather, we seek to win others to Jesus' cause and his ways through prayer, persuasion, example, and argument. So we confess that Jesus is Lord of all, we seek to be obedient to him in all we do, and we pray that through our words and our visible witness of actions, that those around us will come to see that Jesus' way brings peace and justice and joy. And one of the most important ways that we witness to Jesus and to the watching world is through Christian organizations, those that evangelize and those that serve in his name. But of course, for those organizations to be faithful witnesses, to shine the light and love of Jesus in what they say and do, they need freedom, religious freedom, the freedom to be faithful to King Jesus, even though our culture follows other kings and other guides. And it is just this freedom to be different that is being challenged in our day. So the religious freedom that religious organizations need is the main topic for this morning. But we have a few issues to discuss before we get to that topic of institutional religious freedom. And here's the bare bones of what I'm going to do. To be faithful as Christians, we need organizations. Those organizations need to mirror or embody Christian convictions and values. And to be able to mirror Christian convictions, organizations need the freedom to be different than what our culture values. We need more institutional freedom, going against the current trend to restrict institutional freedom. All right, so here's my first point. To be faithful as Christians, we have to create and maintain organizations, not just churches, but also other kinds of organizations. Faith-based organizations, ministries, companies of conviction, a variety of nonprofits and businesses, along with clubs and other types of groups. This is a pretty simple point, I think. To get things done, sometimes you just need yourself, sometimes you just call in a few friends, sometimes you have a temporary group that works with you. But to get big things done, especially when time or distance or significant numbers are involved, you need an organization, a structure, a way to combine the efforts of many people and many skills. You need something more substantial than a flash mob or a voluntary committee, more than a temporary collaboration of convenience. And here's just one example. Compassion International, some of you know of it. It's the eventual outcome of the convicted heart of American pastor Everett Swanson, who in the early 1950s several times visited war-torn Korea. He saw the devastated countryside, he saw the terrible poverty, and most cruelly, he saw the many Korean children who had been turned into orphans by the war. So as he was visiting, a missionary challenged him. You've seen all of this. Now, what do you intend to do about it? So he prayed about it and consulted, and when he was back in the United States, he asked churches to open their hearts to Korean orphans. Out of his vision and their generosity, Pastor Swanson created Compassion International, a parachurch organization. And today, it provides spiritual and material support to more than 1 million children in 26 countries. So just think about that. You cannot be a blessing to more than 1 million children in 26 countries, and you cannot sustain and grow a ministry like this over 60 years without a strong and flourishing and expert organization. It takes more than you and I just getting together for an afternoon. Well, this is obvious. We know it, don't we? We can do many things on our own. We can do many other things if we gather friends together to join us. But many great deeds, the adequate response to many great needs and great opportunities, for that we need strong and sometimes even large organizations. So we all understand that, and yet as Americans we do have a bent towards individualism. Moreover, many of you in this audience, the millennial generation, have seen plenty of mistakes made by organizations. And the researchers say, you can consult your own thoughts, researchers say you're very skeptical of organizations. You may see their value, but you know that their rules can conflict with your own goals. An organization may be pretty good, you like to be part of it, but it may not serve you the way you desire. It may even do many bad things very strongly because it's very big. So there is this tension between individuals and organizations, and in our time, I think, a great sympathy for what individuals want, and decreasing sympathy for the desire of organizations to express a distinctive way of operating and serving. So a conflict between individuals and organizations, and I'll come back to that now and again as we talk. But you've heard the stories of individuals saying, I want you to serve me this way, I want to be hired by you even though you say I don't fit, and so on. So we have to think about that a little bit. For now, I just want to remind you of what we already know. We count on organizations so that big things can get done. So do you recognize this building? It's famous in art history and architectural history. It is, Peter Murray says, the first truly Renaissance work, the first building after the Middle Ages that truly embodied the architectural principles of classical Rome and Greece, this effort to reclaim something from the classical past. And it is an orphanage, a place to take care of abandoned children. This beautiful orphanage is an expression of the Bible's commandment that we are to look after the helpless, including the fatherless, the orphans. And such care has been a mark of the church for 2,000 years now. In Florence, Italy, in the 15th century, that impulse to be faithful to God and compassionate to orphans led to the creation of an organization that could bring together all the resources needed to give spiritual and material care to the many orphans of that city at that time. And it led to a beautiful building to house the organization, not just a work-a-day thing, but something of beauty as this act of compassion went forward. And as I've remarked, in our own time, that same impulse to obey God and care for orphans led to the creation of Compassion International and many other organizations domestically and internationally that come to your mind. Often very large ones, so they can adequately respond to the need. So, to be obedient to God's call of service or teaching, we often need to create organizations, even very large ones, and we often can't do the kind of help we need to give just individually. Now, to my second point. To be faithful to Jesus, we need not only organizations, of course, but organizations that mirror or embody the values in the heart of Jesus and not the convictions and values of some other God or some other guide. That's also a simple point, isn't it? We need organizations. They have to be faithful to Jesus if they are to help us carry out what God calls us to. If, prompted by your love of God and neighbor, you're compelled to start or to join some organization to accomplish some act of service, well, then you have to be sure that the organization performs that service in a way that honors God and not in some other way. The truth is, organizations are not just a way to get things done. Any particular organization is a way to get something done in a particular way. Isn't that why, in the 1950s, a band of men and women, pastors and teachers and business people, joined together to build Dordt College, where before there had been only fields? Not because there weren't other colleges around, but because there was no distinctively Reformed college, no college grounded on the Reformed faith and vision of life redeemed. Remember Kuyper's declaration, there's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not say, mine. So as you look at some square inch, some area of service, some new line of business, isn't this what we should ask? Not just, is this where there needs to be an organization, but does that organization reflect kingdom values? And often, a specifically Christian organization is needed. But I want to remind us, just for a minute, of something else that Kuyper said. The appropriate organization is not always a Christian organization. You know, Abraham Kuyper created or helped to create many Christian organizations, not just the Free University, but he argued sometimes a specifically Christian organization is not the right thing. Maybe that will surprise you to hear that. The question came up in the later 19th century in the Netherlands when unions were beginning to be formed to protect worker rights. So you remember your history about the Industrial Revolution and big factories, big organizations, little protection for workers. So throughout industrializing countries, this effort to create unions to protect worker rights came up. So in the Netherlands, very conscious of religion, how that should play out in life, Calvinist workers had to decide, should they form their own union or should they join with other workers in general unions with Catholics, with secular workers, both the socialists and the liberals? There's a union. What should they do? Kuyper actually discouraged the formation of a Protestant union. The point of a union, he said, is to create a counterweight to the power of the employer so that all elements of the factory, every part of the work community, has a chance to be heard so that justice is done to everyone in the decision-making. But if workers are fragmented into multiple unions, they can easily be ignored by the factory owners. Better to join together, Kuyper said. That's how to achieve the legitimate aim of the union, that countervailing power. Well, as it turns out, socialist and Marxist voices came to shape the general unions in the Netherlands, along with liberals who had no sympathy at all for religion. And very quickly, the Christian workers felt they had no place in that union. They were unfriendly places for people who took faith seriously, as it turned out. And these were unions inspired not by an idea of the work community and how the different parts of the work community could work together, but instead how workers could have a victory over the employers. So, in that case, the Christian union was necessary to create a way to express faithfully in union affairs the Calvinist and Christian values. So that's what happened in the Netherlands. But the goal, as Kuyper said, was an organization faithful to kingdom values, including representing worker rights strongly, and not necessarily a separate Christian union. All right, so just think about that. Sometimes Christian organizations, sometimes other organizations, but they ought to reflect kingdom values in a significant way. So to get things done, we often need organizations. To get things done in a kingdom way, we may need to start or join a distinctively Christian organization, although not always. I think in our day, when so many of our fellow citizens want to follow some leader other than King Jesus, Christian organizations are probably becoming even more important than in the past. Okay, so now to my third big point and the big question of our day. Here's a Christian organization. Will the law allow that organization to remain Christian, to follow kingdom values, or will the law require the organization to change its practices to mirror the values of the secular majority in our country? Well, let me start to talk with you about that by thinking with you about the common good. You'll recall that not many years ago, evangelical leaders often talked about preserving or restoring a Christian America or a moral majority. You all remember that. You've read about it or you remember it personally. Well, to me, that talk was always troubling, not because America didn't have strong Christian influences and a Christian root in a certain way, but because we were so poor at being a Christian nation. And you know the sad story of our many flaws. And on top of that, calling it a Christian nation has a tendency to push out those who have other beliefs. And of course, that's not right in a political community. So the talk of a Christian nation, I think, was always a little bit unhappy. It didn't lead us in the right direction thinking about things properly. And it certainly led to a lot of hostility by many other people in our society. Well, given all that background, it's much more complicated than that, but that's enough, I think. Given that background, I sympathize with everyone who, over the past few years, has brought to the foreground not the idea of restoring a Christian America, but instead a deep concern for how Christians can contribute to the common good. Our country surely is religiously and morally very diverse. Christians are just part of it. Here we are living together with people of other faiths, other convictions. We have to get along in mutual respect. And even though we have many different convictions, we can and should contribute to the common good, not just retreat into our own corner and serve the good of our own fellow believers. Of course, that's actually a great Jesus theme, isn't it? Love God and your neighbor, whoever your neighbor is. So, making contributions to the common good is what we're called to do. But in focusing on the common good, we should never forget that as Christian believers, we often have something distinctive and vital to offer to others. A Bible-informed understanding of what is good and right, of what is most helpful to people in need, about what kinds of relationships can really thrive, how best to raise children, how to accurately interpret history, what are all the dimensions that go into personhood that should be taken into account in therapy or medical practice, and so on. And other faith communities also have distinctive visions. So I think what we want to look for is how organizations can be free to make their uncommon contributions to the common good, right? It's a contribution to the common good, but it's in a distinctive way. And that's why there's a Dordt College and not just a University of Iowa or a Briarcliff University. And that's why there are all these other kinds of faith-based service organizations. Compassion International, we talked about a little bit, Catholic Charities, World Vision, Bethany Christian Services, and a whole long list. And each of them wants to operate consistent with its founding religious conviction, to make its best contribution. But as you know, that desire is being challenged more and more in our day. Lawmakers, instead of saying, well, you do things differently, but we can see the value of it, maybe it's even better in some ways, increasingly lawmakers and activists are saying these other ways are just wrong and hateful and ought to be stopped. Rather than preserving the freedom for those faith-based organizations to be different, lawmakers are often saying we need instead to subject them to rules that will make them act the way secular organizations do, to do things the way the majority in our society values and not the way they say the religious principles require. Well, it's a very complex process. It goes on differently at the federal, state, and local level, but I think we can simplify it into three trends. First of all, we no longer have a strong Christian consensus, but instead great religious and moral diversity. So if there is any public consensus at all, in many ways it's a secular consensus that in some important ways values things the Bible says are just not optimal. That's the first trend. And secondly, our governments increasingly are insisting that private organizations have to be regulated, and they ought to be regulated so they follow those secular values that the society has decided is the best way to do things. So, more and more non-Christian values increasingly turned into laws and regulations, court decisions, that the government requires every private organization to follow. Of course, we are a country of religious freedom, so there's a religious freedom angle to this as well. But third, rather than honoring in a very strong way the religious freedom of faith-based organizations to depart from those secular norms, those secular rules, governments increasingly claim that religious freedom is a narrow freedom that protects churches but not parachurch organizations, that protects worship but not service of neighbor, that protects your thinking, not your doing, and certainly not your doing if it involves serving the public and not just members of your own faith. Some of you will recognize those trends in the conflict over the health insurance contraceptives mandate. You've all heard about that. Of course, it's not about birth control, even about abortifacients. It's about whether government can rightly require organizations that have different convictions about pro-life, about contraception, require that organization to do things the way the secular government wants things to be done. Or is there a religious freedom that should come in play and organizations can dissent, be different than that consensus? And you might know that the government has said we'll allow churches to be exempt from the mandate. They can do things according to their conscience. The government has said to businesses, tough luck. Once you make money, you can have no conscience. That's just a rough translation, but it's something like that. Playing out in Supreme Court. And for parachurch organizations, for ministries, Dordt College and others, the government has said, fine, you're not a church, we won't give you full religious freedom. You're not making money, so we'll give you a little religious freedom. So there's a so-called accommodation for parachurch organizations in which the organization can buy insurance that doesn't include the methods and pills that the organization thinks are immoral because they kill life. And once the organization says that's the kind of insurance we want, then the insurer goes to all the employees and says, we'll pay for everything anyway. Doesn't seem like much of an accommodation. So a lot of concern in Washington about that kind of trampling on the conscience of many organizations, but particularly about this way of thinking about religious freedom. If you're a church, you have full religious freedom. If you work in commerce, you have none. If you're a faith-based nonprofit, we'll just honor you kind of by words and not in deeds. And what's that going to mean for the future? Well, our concern is that over time, these organizations are going to discover that they can't be true to their faith. Well, to refer to Abraham Kuyper again, we can say that we're losing as a society a commitment to sphere sovereignty. Sphere sovereignty is a reminder that government does not create society and its many organizations. Rather, families, art institutes, colleges, hospitals, adoption agencies, businesses, media organizations, and so on, they all have their God-created areas of service, and they often express a religiously based way of carrying out those different services. While the government has to protect individual rights and act so these different organizations can live together harmoniously, it's not the legitimate duty of government to lord it over them, trying to change what they do and how they do it. The government should respect their qualified sovereignty and not override it, and that was the fight in the Netherlands about the Free University. Could it express a different view than the government or not? Well, as you may know, or might guess, the major disputes in our day about how much freedom organizations shaped by faith should be allowed to have has come to revolve around three important topics. Religion's one of them. Second one is reproductive issues, abortion and contraception. And the third one is gay or LGBT rights, same-sex marriage, and sexual orientation discrimination. These three areas, we're seeing increasing clashes between faith-based organizations and the government. To some activists and government officials and judges, it's just wrong, and therefore it ought to be illegal for a Christian student club to insist that its leaders have to be faithful to the Bible in both belief and personal conduct. To these activists and government officials and judges, that's just religious discrimination, and it's anti-gay. And so the clubs are often told, if you stick to that kind of exclusionary policy, only Christians, you'll lose your place among the approved student groups on campus. Similarly, to some activists, government officials, and judges, it's just plain wrong, and therefore it should be illegal for a religious organization, especially if it receives any form of government assistance, to hire only people who confess the same beliefs as the organization, who agree to follow the organization's code of personal conduct. So a place like Dordt College is very suspect to many people in Washington, D.C. To those critics, there is no legitimate, good, rational reason for that kind of a policy. It is merely a way to keep out people the organization must despise. So, Dort thinks it's a way of having a Christian institution. To many people in Congress, a policy of hiring just believers, having a student conduct policy, employee conduct policy, that's just a way of keeping out people you hate. To some activists and government officials and judges, it's just wrong and therefore should be illegal for a faith-based hospital not to perform elective abortions. And it doesn't matter to these critics that the hospital or clinic or doctor right around the corner does perform abortions. Instead, they say, it violates the rights of a woman seeking an abortion if the Catholic hospital in front of her won't do abortions. Such a bigoted hospital ought to lose Medicaid and Medicare funds and perhaps not be allowed to open its doors at all. To some activists, government officials, and judges, it is just wrong, and therefore it should be illegal, for an adoption agency to have the idea that every child, if possible, should have a believing father and mother married to each other for life, instead of placing the child with a single person, or a cohabiting couple, or a gay couple, or a same-sex married couple. It doesn't matter that other adoption agencies are eager to help that single person, that cohabiting couple, the same-sex married couple. Every agency, they say, should be forced to operate as if all these types of households are equally valuable, or else they ought to close their doors. And some of them are closing their doors in our country and elsewhere. After 2,000 years during which one of the key marks of the Church's faithfulness has been its care for orphans, in our own day in the United States and in other countries, many faith-based adoption agencies have been told by the government, abandon your beliefs and practices about families and faithful sexual relationships, or else abandon adoption services. And a growing number of faith-based adoption agencies have had to close their doors because of that. Catholic adoption agencies have been in the news about that, to close their doors in Illinois, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Massachusetts. In England and Wales, there used to be 12 Catholic adoption agencies. There are now 0, just over the course of 6 years. In Illinois, an evangelical adoption agency had to break off its partnership with the government to place children because it wanted to place children with evangelical mother-father families. Well, I think I want to say here that this pressure on religious organizations to change their practices is not, or at least is not always, intended to be anti-Christian. It's meant instead to be pro-justice, pro-equality, pro-kids' rights, pro-human rights. But here's the problem. Our society just does not have a consensus on justice, equality, human rights, what's best for children. We differ sometimes very deeply about the value of religion, about what a flourishing marriage looks like, about the best interest of children, about abortion and euthanasia, about how best to help the poor and addicts, about the role of religion in medical care, and about many other things. And so, to respect one another, to respect conscience, a fundamental value in our country, to honor our Constitution's guarantee of the free exercise of religion, there ought to be robust protections for persons and organizations that do not share our society's current secular consensus, such as it is. There ought to be religious freedom, not just for individuals, but for organizations that are shaped by faith. So our laws, instead of pressing for more and more uniformity as we become more diverse, has to preserve space for diversity. There has to continue to be legal room for Dordt College, Compassion International, Catholic Charities, Hobby Lobby, Jewish Social Services, and nearly countless other organizations shaped by faith to make their distinctive, their uncommon contributions their common good. That's the way the faith is lived out in life. And that freedom is increasingly important as our society's consensus becomes less and less friendly to Christianity and becomes more and more secular. In our religiously diverse society, in our morally plural society, Christians need the freedom to be countercultural, not just in our personal lives, not just in our churches, but in organizations that we create. In our religiously and morally diverse society, we need more religious freedom, not less. And that freedom has to extend to faith-based organizations that serve the public and not to be limited to individuals to worship and to the church. Religious exercise, after all, is something we do not just in church and personally, but also out in society. As my organization's logo says, you see it up there, religious organizations should be free to flourish even when they are shaped by faith. Both those things ought to be true. Our laws should respect our religious and moral diversity and not try to suppress views that are currently unpopular. And I want to stress that institutional freedom doesn't actually suppress individual rights, as we're sometimes told. Well, there is a little dilemma there. So you just think, you watch that, we have diverse organizations because we have diverse views. And those diverse views don't just belong to the organizations, but they belong to people who want to work in organizations or be served by organizations. So some employees want to work in a religious environment, even though others don't. And some customers want to be served in a faith-shaped way, even though others don't. That's part of our pluralism in our society. Some, on the other hand, employees and customers prefer a secular organization, a great diversity of them. So respect for each other requires respect for these diverse choices, including diverse organizations, even when we disagree with some of the views that guide some of those organizations. All right. I want to affirm that not every view that's out there in organizations is right and God-pleasing, of course. And we wish that all those organizations, employees, customers, and so on, would do things the way we are convinced the Bible teaches us the way we should do things. So we do wish and pray that our fellow citizens, our neighbors, will come to acknowledge Jesus Christ as King. But I don't think religious freedom is a barrier to our witness, but instead it's a means to maintain a clear witness in our morally and religiously diverse society. So let me talk about religious freedom as a way we can be a witness in our society, and also how we have to be a witness to sustain religious freedom. Some of you will remember the prayer that we're supposed to pray for leaders. In 1 Timothy 2, written to Christians living in a pagan, anti-Christian Roman Empire. So you read that to yourself, and I hope you say, this is just a little bit odd in a way. You know, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but this is kind of startling prayer for political leaders. We're going to pray for them. Shouldn't we pray that they become Christians and ruled by the Bible? Shouldn't they force everybody to do things in a biblical way? Well, this says we should pray for religious freedom. Isn't that what it means? Pray that we can live holy and godly lives in peace in the midst of a society that has other values. And if we can do that, if we can live out our convictions in our society, what might be the outcome? Well, we'll please God, and He may bless our efforts, He may bless our society with a harvest of new believers, people who, out of conviction, follow King Jesus in all that they do. We'll pray for our leaders that they give us religious freedom. Religious freedom gives us an opportunity to be a witness as our society changes. But we face a bit of a problem, don't we? We need religious freedom so that we may live holy and godly lives, personally and through our organizations, even when many in our society have other gods and other goals. But why should that kind of society preserve religious freedom when so many powerful people are sure that religion is not good and that religious organizations may do more harm than good? We need religious freedom in this society. It's a way of witnessing, but why should we expect our society to respect religious freedom? Well, I think, in fact, that witness of deeds is the key. That witness of deeds can be persuasive even when arguments fall on deaf ears and hard hearts. This passage from 1 Peter, I think, should give us hope. So you read it. In many ways, we live in a paganizing society. We're exiles and foreigners in our own country. In many ways, we're followers of a different king than most of our fellow citizens. And increasingly, our fellow citizens regard many of our views and values to be wrong, harmful, hateful, cramped, and bigoted. But these verses suggest that it's possible for our fellow citizens, even if they think our convictions are wrong and crazy, to see that the works of service that we do are genuinely good deeds, and even to glorify God in some way and at some time because of those good works. Works they did not expect to be good because they think religion is wrong and harmful. Isn't that striking and hopeful? Acts of service, the things we do personally, the things that faith-based service organizations do, these acts of services can be a testimony to the goodness of God, even when people don't believe that God is good and they don't want to hear the gospel. These good deeds, when they're connected to biblical convictions, these good deeds may yet speak to a disbelieving culture, a culture that needs to become convinced again that religion is not necessarily bad, and therefore religious freedom is a positive thing. It's a way to make possible in society the good deeds that they actually admire. So let me end with one last image and with a reminder about the early years of Christianity. I'll make sure that's up there. So, have you been to the Roman Forum, that area of large area of ruins in Rome that date back 2,000 and more years? I took this photograph when I was there, I think about 8 years ago, and I was reflecting on cultural decline, cultural pessimism, and cultural renewal. So what do you see in that picture? Well, I think there are two main features. One is a triumphal arch in the foreground, kind of low down, and then there's this big church up higher in the background. That triumphal arch celebrates great victories in war by Emperor Septimius Severus and his sons in the years 195 to 197 AD. So this big arch created to signify that triumph over the enemies of the empire. And at one time, now you have to imagine this, it was a glorious arch standing together with other gleaming monuments and buildings, sacred buildings to the many Roman and Greek gods, and also secular buildings like the Senate building, that's where we get our idea of a Senate, and the rostrum, the platform where speeches were made to the gathered crowds. This area was the heart of Rome, and therefore the heart of the civilized world, as they thought it was. This was the glory of the civilized world, a concentration of power and monumental art and temples to all the gods of the pagan Romans. At one time, this arch was sparkling instead of eroded, and it was surrounded by gleaming white marble and gold and brightly colored statues. That arch and the other monuments and buildings celebrated the might of Rome, the glories of the empire, the wonders of Roman culture, the wonders of Roman art, administration, engineering, military force, and all that. And you could just recall that powerful images in the movie Gladiator to kind of think about what the Romans thought of themselves. So now imagine yourself, when it was glorious like that, as one of the small band of Christians, a small minority in the ancient Roman Empire in the year 200 or so. Here you are looking at this arch and at the other monuments and the temples and saying, nevertheless, despite all the glory of these structures, all the power that these structures represent, Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. There's only one true God, it's not the Roman emperor. What is real and true and lasting is not these monuments and this civilization, but instead, those people who know Jesus is Lord. I'm sure it was easy to be a cultural pessimist in those days, looking at this glory. And yet, of course, as we know, the glory of pagan Rome was extinguished. The empire fell. It fell into ruins, literally. Pagan Roman civilization, pagan Roman might was transcended and replaced. And it was transcended and replaced by a civilization deeply shaped by Christianity. That transition and replacement of pagan Rome by Christianity is symbolized and exemplified by that church up higher because it's later. This is a church of St. Luke the Evangelist and St. Martina, a 3rd century martyr. The original church on this spot was built in the early medieval era. The church was rebuilt in the 17th century in this Baroque style. Over the years, sometimes right on top of pagan Rome, a new civilization was built. That old civilization was transcended by the Christian church. The God and perspectives and commitments of that small band of Christians had overcome the glory and practices and beliefs that were exemplified by the monuments and temples and secular buildings of the Roman Forum. Pagan Roman civilization had been displaced and transformed by Western civilization with its Christian inspiration. Of course, it's never been perfect, and I don't want to suggest that. There's always been too much injustice in Western civilization. But there was and is much that is good in our civilization, much that was better than pagan civilization. Universities, modern science, legal systems, our sense of justice, compassion for the needy, democracy and human rights, respect for women, care for children, and these and many other undoubted goods came out of the Christian overtaking of pagan Rome. We should be grateful for these good practices and institutions and attitudes and honor them. This was a God-honoring change in civilization. So how was this change made? That's a long and complicated story. Historians don't agree on it. I found very helpful the book by Rodney Stark called The Rise of Christianity. He says it wasn't because Constantine took over, you've all heard that story, because he seized power and then outlawed paganism, made Christianity the official religion. That story is just not true. That happened later. Constantine did not ban paganism, did not make Christianity the official religion. Well, what is the true story then? Of course, the movement of the Spirit that we can't quite follow in history is part of it, leading people to convert. So there's that, but also a visible factor, the visible good works of Christians, just as the Apostle Peter wrote in the verses we saw just a moment ago. Rodney Stark writes about a wide range of good works, the things that Christians did differently than pagans did because Christians believed in Christ and not pagan gods. Compassionate care for the poor. The Christians neither aborted babies nor put newborns out to die because a family didn't want them. That women's status and rights were lifted up. The Christians bridged the gap between rich and poor, between warring ethnicities and other differences. And one thing that Stark really stresses, Roman cities, civilized, were nevertheless crowded and dirty and subject to periodic plagues. The epidemics could claim a large proportion of the population. There was no medicine, no understanding of how the plague was spread or how to contain it. So when the plague arrived, pagan leaders and pagan priests fled as far as they could, leaving the sick and poor and powerless to help themselves. Christians, the Christian church, acted differently. They didn't have medicine either. They didn't know public health principles either, but they had a love for their neighbors and for each other. So they stayed when the plague came. The church, the community of the faithful, took care of the sick and dying. Just by providing food and water and care to the sick, the church strengthened many of those who had become infected, kept them strong enough so that their own bodies could fight off death. Given care like this, the death rate was cut by as much as 2/3 in a city. Well, after a plague or two had swept through a city, a disproportionate number of those who remained living would be Christians helped by other Christians and pagans helped by their Christian neighbors. And those pagans who had been helped, well, they had seen visible good works, and many of them converted. So, through these epidemics and in other ways, the church grew not just because it proclaimed something, but because it lived out something that people could see. Just as the Apostle Peter said, these Christians lived such good lives among the pagans that, although pagans were sure that Christians were wrong, they nevertheless could see the Christians' good deeds, and they were prompted to glorify God and to convert. Christians were faithful. They neither assimilated to pagan culture nor fled from it. Instead, they served their neighbors with the good deeds that Jesus inspired and shaped. They contributed to the common good in an uncommon way. Well, when I think back to that church and that triumphal arch, when I remember Rodney Stark's history of the social impact of early Christianity, when I think about those verses in 1 Peter 2, then I say, we don't know what's going to happen in the years ahead in our own culture, but we should not be pessimists just because we see all those negative trends that I mentioned briefly. We should not be pessimists because of this growing distrust of religion, a growing desire to restrict religious freedom. No, it's possible for our fellow citizens to admire good deeds inspired by faith and to change their minds about religious freedom and about religion. But that's only possible if these good deeds are visibly connected to faith and can't be interpreted as just being humanitarian. So a winsome case for religious freedom is built by showing our society good deeds that they admire and clearly connecting those good deeds to the faith that produced them. Faithful, faith-based organizations not only do good, but they can communicate about the value of faith and about religious freedom, even to those convinced that these are evils that should be suppressed. Well, we live in a very challenging time. When I work in religious freedom, that's real clear to me. This is a time, though, for courage and commitment and compassion. Many in our society have decided that Jesus is not good news, but instead bad news. But our calling is not to hide our heads, nor to hide our light. Rather, now is just the time to demonstrate the good news of Jesus in visible acts that are clearly rooted in our faith. And now is the time to pray, not for a lost Christian America, but for religious freedom, so that we can live godly lives and be faithful and winsome witnesses to the King of Kings. Thank you.
I would like to thank everyone for coming this morning. Dr. Carlson-Thies will be with us again this evening at 7:30 in the Ribbons Academic Complex, classroom 1144 and 1148. He will be presenting tales about politics and faith from inside the Beltway, reflecting on his personal experiences in Washington. I hope to see you all there. Thank you and have a great day.